Greetings to all of you, and welcome to another session on the book of Revelation, session number 11. I'm Pastor Timothy Muse, lead pastor here at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio, and it's a joy to be with you today as we spend time studying the book of Revelation. It's kind of hard to believe that we're in the 11th week of our study, and we have traveled as far as we have in the book of Revelation. If this is your first session with us, I certainly would encourage you to look back over the previous sessions found on my YouTube page. Definitely go back and at least listen to the first session. That talks a lot about the background and the context, not only of the book of Revelation, but also apocalyptic literature, and what this literature means and what it's trying to say. The book of Revelation, as we have continued to see, is not necessarily meant to be a chronological timeline from beginning to end with a set date of when it's going to start. This is apocalyptic literature. This is looking into the future. And looking into the future can be very difficult. It can create and present a lot of uncertainty. So, that is why the book of Revelation has been, for 2,000 years, the subject of intense study, both from a biblical standpoint as well as a societal standpoint and a future standpoint. So as we continue to travel through this book, we see that there's a lot of things in here that we can connect to, some things that we can't, some things that make sense, some things that don't. So part of this journey is hope to unpack some of this book for you as the faithful, you as the believer, or you as the novice, you as just trying to get some information and figure out what this book is all about. So I would encourage you to have a Bible in front of you. I'm working with the New Revised Standard Version, but you can have any copy of the Bible in front of you, any translation or paraphrase, any language. I mean, if you speak another language or you read through another language, please feel free to do that. Language is a fascinating thing. There is no one singular language that speaks the purest. The New Testament was written in Greek. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew. So what we are dealing with, unless you're reading the ancient Greek, we're dealing with translations. We're dealing with people putting words together to try to figure out what is being said. So there's always going to be textual variations and differences. And I encourage you to have a Bible in front of you. If you like paper, certainly open up your Bible. If you want something on a digital platform, then you could use BibleGateway.com is a great resource. It has all the translations. It's a free resource. So just go in BibleGateway.com and look up Revelation. And we're going to start in chapter 6 today. So and then you can see all the different translations and paraphrases. So work with what you're most comfortable with. The Bible is a living document. It is something that speaks to us. It is not just something that was written thousands of years ago and left. It is actually a document, even though the words don't change. It's a living document because every time we read it, we change. We're in a different place. We're in a different understanding. So I encourage you to have a Bible in front of you. At the end, my credentials will be up, my contact, the way to get a hold of me. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. If I can answer them directly, I will, or if I can answer them in the next session, I will do that to try to make sense out of things so that so that we know what's going on. Okay, so we're in chapter 6 now. When we ended chapter 5, we had John was taken up into the throne room. He's in the throne room of God. God's sitting on the throne, and his right hand is a scroll. What was written down at the beginning of time and sealed with 7 seals, universal seals. It's a universal truth. In order for the future to unfold, in order for the future to come about, then the scroll needs to be opened up. And someone needs to be worthy to take the scroll from God and open its seals. Excuse me. So John is up there waiting to see who's worthy. Well, ultimately, we see that the Lamb, Jesus, the sacrifice lamb, the one who willingly gave his life, is worthy to take the scroll and break its seals. That's what we're longing for. We're longing for this to happen. Every believer is longing for this to happen. Now, this is not going to be easy. We're going to see that this is going to be very difficult, but ultimately this means that the new era of God's reign is ushered in, perfection, free of sin, free of death, free of pain, where everything is made new. That's what we're waiting for. We as Christians cry out, "Come, Lord Jesus," because we are longing for the day when Christ returns, because that longing means that God's eternal reign comes, and that those who are sleeping in the dead are risen, and that all that is broken and hurtful and painful is washed away. So that's what we're longing for. So John is, it says that John wept because no one could break the seals and open the scroll. But that's the whole point of the crucified and risen Savior, Jesus Christ, is that he is worthy to break the scroll. So John sees that. Everybody gives thanks. The Lamb, Jesus, has the scroll. And this is where we are now in chapter 6. So we're chapter 6, verse 1. So this is verse 1 and 2. John says, "Then I saw the Lamb open one of the 7 seals. And I heard one of the 4 living creatures call out, as with a voice of thunder, 'Come.' I looked, and there was a white horse. Its rider had a bow. A crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer." Okay, so the opening of the seals. The first seal is open on the scroll, and the first 4 seals are the 4 horsemen. We've heard about them. So the first seal is open, and the first horse comes out. And that horse, a white horse, okay? White horses are, they're meant to show majesty and power. Kings ride white horses. Now, I'm gonna go back to Charles Talbert. I've referred to him before, and this is the base text that I'm using for this study. So, one of the things to keep in mind now before I jump in, I should have said this, but I'll say it now. One of the things to keep in mind: the seals are broken not by accident, not because God has run out of time. This comes out of God's desire. God's willing this to happen. God is finally saying it is time to open the scroll. It is time to let the final begin. Nothing happens by chance. God doesn't fall into an accident. God doesn't lose a game of poker with the devil and have to start this to happen. God is doing this by choice. This is of God's will and initiative. God pulls the scroll out and reveals it out of God's initiative. The Lamb takes the scroll and God allows it out of initiative. So this all begins out of initiative. It is God's desire. The Lamb's initiative, and this all is part of the scope of God's will. God is intimately involved in this. The Lamb hasn't created rebellion and taken over the throne. God's doing this out of God's will. When the end comes, when God wills the end to happen, it's not going to be pretty. It's not meant to be. Because something new is going to come from the old. But as the old passes away, it passes away very difficultly. It doesn't happen just tenderly. Think of anything in life. Think of anything in life. And think about where we are right now. We're in this pandemic. We're in this new reality. Did it come about gently? No, it didn't. It came about difficultly. It came about with struggle and sacrifice. We don't even know the extent of that struggle and sacrifice yet. But we're here in this new reality because the old reality passed away very difficultly. Just like a forest fire. You want a new forest, the forest burns. Well, a forest fire is not a gentle thing. A storm that levels a house or levels a field in order to create new, that storm is violent. The end is going to be violent. It's not going to be easy. That's what the book is telling us. All right, so first seal, first horse. First horse of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Out came a white horse whose rider had a bow. This echo of the dreaded Parthian warriors who had, on one or more occasion, defeated the Roman armies is used to symbolize wars of conquest. So the first thing that's going to happen is this white horse, this rider with a bow, is going to go out. There's going to be wars of conquest. Powers are going to look to take over other powers. Now, one could argue, this has been happening for a long time. One could argue that, and it has been, since the beginning of time, kingdom has sought to conquer kingdom. That's how kingdoms grow. Look, we as a nation started out as a nation of conquest. The first settlers came over as British citizens. And then they rose up and rebelled. And they conquered the ruling army. That's a war of conquest. Now, they didn't go onto a foreign land. They took their own land. But you see what I'm talking about here. We could argue that this has been going on a long time. And it has been going on a long time. Wars of conquest are one of the signs of the impending end, which would certainly argue that, are we in the end time now? Has that seal been broken? Maybe it has. But there's another thing to keep in mind, and this is really where I want you to see. Part of the apocalyptic literature is looking into the future. Part of the apocalyptic literature is meant to be written to bring peace and comfort. Okay? So John is revealing this to the people, the Christians living in Rome, who are being persecuted by the Romans, for comfort and peace. The first horsemen of the apocalypse, the war of conquest emanating back to the Parthians, who defeated the Romans. Well, if the Christians are being held under oppression by the Roman army, then what does that say? That says that there needs to be hope that the Romans are going to be defeated. If you were a Christian living in Rome, and you read this, you heard this would bring you great joy. Knowing that a mightier army would come to defeat the Romans. You'd feel good about this. Now, one never knows whether a conquering army is going to be benevolent or malevolent. That's all meant to be seen. But the Romans were pretty awful. So just about anything had to be better for the Christians than the Romans. So the first horseman of the apocalypse is something that is very, very comforting to the Christians. Because the Romans are going to be defeated. A conquering army is going to come in. Now, you can extrapolate this out and say, okay, the angel army could be considered a conquering army that would come in and conquer the sinful of the world and take the world for God's glory. So as you look at this, you can see this as a comfort. It's probably not necessarily meant to be, but for the Christians who are, in context in Rome, they'd be very happy for an army to come in and conquer the Romans. And actually, an army did come in and conquer the Romans, but that's a whole another historical lesson down the road. Okay. So the first horse of the apocalypse, white horse, which, again, this is where we need to make sure that we're clear about biblical interpretation. Because what we hear and what the Bible says isn't always the same. So this is what the Bible is saying about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The four horsemen of the apocalypse are both biblical and mythical, and they've come into myth. So that's the first horse of the apocalypse. All right, so verse 3. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature call out, "Come." And out came another horse, bright red.
its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people would slaughter one another. And he was given a great sword. Okay, so one of the things to understand here is that we hearken back to the prophet Zechariah, who talked about a red horse, talked about the 4 chariots of God. Okay, so this is not something new. The people who would be hearing this would be able to hearken back to that prophet, Zechariah. But the second horse that comes out, the red horse, out came a bright red horse. This is Talbert again, whose rider was a catalyst for people slaying one another. This symbolizes internal anarchy among nations. So not only is one of the horsemen of the apocalypse a warrior, a conqueror, but the second horseman of the apocalypse brings about internal strife, internal anarchy. Now again, from a Roman perspective, for Christians in Rome, this also would have been very comforting. The Romans were vastly terrified of internal strife. They ruled with an iron fist. Pax Romano, the peace of Rome, came at the tip of a sword. They ruled with an iron fist, and they were terrified of internal strife, terrified of it. They were terrified that their populace was going to rise up. I mean, think about Jerusalem. When Jesus came into Jerusalem, Jerusalem was the capital of the Jewish state, but it was a Roman territory. Now, the Jews had a king, Herod, of course, but Jerusalem was overseen by a governor of Rome, Pilate, and there was Roman soldiers. The Romans kept peace by force. They were terrified of internal strife. They were terrified of people rising up, of people slaughtering people. So the second horseman of the apocalypse, not only does it speak again to that comfort of Christians, but it also speaks to the decline of civilized interaction. The apocalyptic world will come about. We will see the decline of civilized interaction. People will rise up and slaughter each other. Anarchy among nations. And not between nation and nation. That's really the thing. It's not about anarchy from nation 1 to nation 2, but it's anarchy in nation 1 and in nation 2. That's where the downfall comes in, is the internal anarchy. When rule and government is no longer acknowledged. When there is no overarching or meta-narrative of civilization and society. That's the second horseman of the apocalypse. Now, again, like conquerors, we could say, wow, I mean, that sounds like right where we're at right now, doesn't it? I mean, we're pretty much in the middle of civil anarchy here. We're dealing with civil anarchy. And yes, we are. Excuse me. Very dry in here today. Yes, we are. On multiple levels, we're seeing a lot of anarchy. We're seeing a lot of internal strife. Is it worse than it was before? I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think that we're seeing anything worse than we were before. Is it different? Yeah, sure, of course it is. It's always different. Is it worse? Some levels, yeah. Some levels it's worse. Some levels not so much. We're still fighting battles that we've been fighting, internally for 50, 100 years. Is it going to be our downfall? No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think our civilization and our society is bigger and greater than this. Do I think the red horse has been released? No. I don't think it has. There may be some who would like to say so. Say so for profit or for gain, power. But I don't think it has. I don't think we're here yet. I don't think the red horse has truly been released yet. Because we're slaughtering each other, but not to the caliber that is reflected here in the apocalyptic literature. We've always slaughtered each other. Humanity can be so terrible to each other. But I don't think that the red horse has been released yet. Now, there would be those who would argue with me, and that's okay. Because I don't know. I'm not in the courts of God. I'm not in the courts of God. But my vision of what civil anarchy would look like, I'm not seeing it. Civil unrest, yeah. Some civil disobedience, yeah. Battle lines being drawn, yeah. That's all happening. But that's always happened. It's always happened. It's actually through that civil unrest that we move forward. Now, we don't ever move when we're not in conflict. We need to be in conflict in order to move. Now, do I agree with all the conflict? No. All the levels of conflict? No. No, I think there are some levels of conflict that don't move us forward. But I want you to think back over last 100 years. We've seen a lot of advancement in civilization, but that advancement has come through conflict. I think of the suffrage movement. Somebody didn't just wake up one day and go, oh, maybe we should let women vote. No. They had to fight for it. They had to create their own civil disobedience, civil unrest. When schools were desegregated, well, that wasn't very easy. So civil unrest has always moved us forward, but there's a difference between civil unrest and anarchy. And I don't see anarchy. Maybe in spots. I'm not blind. But I don't see total unrest, total anarchy. At least not yet. So the second horse of the apocalypse. So you have wars of conquest, one nation conquering another nation. The second one is anarchy. Anarchy among nations. People slaying one another. Again, people have always slayed each other. I think what the Bible is referring to in this is not necessarily it is referring to one person slaying another, but in mass on a level that would be totally intolerable. Beyond the levels of what we saw in the Civil War is what I'm referring to. Okay. So, when he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature call out. Remember, the living creatures are the ones that guard the throne. They're the ones there at the throne. Okay, so I heard the third living creature call out, "Come." I looked and there was a black horse. Its rider held a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's pay, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay. But do not damage the olive oil or the wine." Okay, so again, this is Talbert's explanation. Out came a black horse whose rider had a balance in his hands, a scales. We've all seen them, balance one to the other. Okay, all right. An audition confirms the meaning of the vision. A quart of wheat, the amount required for a man for food for 1 day, for a denarii. That's a day's wage. And 3 quarts of barley, a low-grade substitute for a family for a day. So if one person has a quart of wheat for a day, but a whole family can live on 3 quarts of barley for a day, for a denarii, for a day's wage. But do not harm the olive oil and the wine. Now, it would take a worker, it would take all a worker could earn in a day just to feed himself adequately, to provide for his family. Also could be done at a subsistence level. So it would take a worker all day just to feed himself for a day. All right? And to provide for his family could be done at a subsistence level. This horse and rider then symbolizes famine. Famine. I mean, think about it for a minute. The idea that a quart of wheat or 3 quarts of barley, that that which would just feed someone for a day costs the amount that they would make in a day, well, that would leave no room for anything else. Housing, clothing, shoes, water. So if we worked all day, and all we could do was buy food, would we be full? No. No. Because we'd be spending that money on housing, clothes. I mean, what's the point? Here we live in Ohio, okay? All right, so we're living in Ohio. What's the point of working all day just to get enough money to buy food, and buy food but have no place to live and no clothes on your back? I mean, trying to be out in the sun, well, for one thing, you can't go to work without clothes on your back, of course. You can't live in a world without clothes on your back. But in the summertime, you would squelch, in the wintertime, you'd freeze. All right? So if you were working all day for just enough money to feed yourself, you'd go hungry because you'd put that money in paying rent, living. So when a quart of wheat costs a denarii, when 3 quarts of barley cost a denarii, that is massive inflation. That means famine. When food becomes that expensive, that means famine. That means that people will die from famine. Now, we've got hunger in our world. We've got hunger in our world. There's no doubt about it. You know, again, this one wouldn't be very comforting for anybody. This one wouldn't be very comforting for anybody that food would elevate to that level. But you can imagine what would happen. You can imagine what would happen if food would be elevated. If famine happens, what happens with famine? Famine creates rebellion. You know, when people are hungry and they see their leaders aren't doing anything to help them, they rebel. Good people who become hungry will do anything. Anybody will do just about anything to eat. You know, we can think that we wouldn't. We can think that we wouldn't. But when we become hungry, and I mean truly hungry, I'm not talking I just slept for 8 hours and I haven't had anything since dinner hungry. I'm talking I haven't eaten in 4 days hungry, 5 days hungry, 7 days hungry. You know, when we talk about, you know, the commandment not to steal, okay? I don't think most people go out and desire to steal. Go 5 or 7 days without food, and that loaf of bread there on the counter that costs $1, and it's looking pretty enticing to throw in your bag without paying for it. Okay? So famine is something that we can all feel. Hunger is something we can all feel. And when people are hungry, they're desperate. Desperation leads to rebellion. Again, something that the Romans were terrified of. Desperation leads to rebellion. Famine leads to people dying. So the third horseman of the apocalypse is about bringing about such inflation that people go hungry, that people no longer have access to adequate food. And that'd be a terrible thing. Again, because people start going into a famine. We've seen what happens with famine. I remember, younger in my life, seeing pictures of Ethiopia during the famine. Famine is a terrible thing. Famine is a terrible thing. Going hungry is a terrible thing. So hunger, famine, is going to be the third horseman of the apocalypse that comes forth from breaking the seals. Okay, so this is verse 7 and 8. When he, the Lamb, opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature call out, "Come." I looked, and there was a pale green horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed with him. And they were given authority over a fourth of the earth, to kill with sword, famine, and pestilence. and by the wild animals of the earth. All right, so fourth living creature. Again, this is Talbert speaking. This is Talbert's words. Out came a pale horse, pale green horse, whose rider's name was Death. Hades, the realm of the dead, followed him. Hades is different from hell, please. And this is where, this is really important here. Hades is the realm of the dead. Okay? This is the place where the dead reside. Hell, excuse me, as we know it, is a place of torment and torture and suffering. That's not what Hades is. Hades is the place where the dead reside. Hades is the place where the dead are housed, if you will. Hell is the place of eternal torment and suffering. So it is the realm of the dead that follows death on the pale green horse. Now remember, in the Jewish culture, as well as in just about any culture, I mean, nobody wants to hang out with the dead. That's not where we want to be. And yes, it does kind of have the Walking Dead vision to it. I don't necessarily think that's what John is intending. But, in our Hollywood modern day storytelling, we can create a lot of these things. One of the reasons why, for those of you who participate in worship, you may remember the Apostles' Creed. I believe in Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, born of a virgin, suffered under Pontius Pilate, crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell. Do you remember when that, in the LBW that came out in 78, he descended into hell. Okay? The modern church, in the past couple of decades, we've moved, and even though it was inappropriate, but we've moved from hell to the dead. Because our modern brain, when we think about hell, we think about Pinhead, we think about Hellraiser, we think about Dante, we think about suffering and burning and fire and sulfur. But when we think about Jesus descending to the dead, it's not that Jesus descended in the depths of hell and went down into the fiery furnace and put it out. That's not what the scriptures tell us. The scriptures tell us that Jesus descended into the realm of those who died before he came along. But aren't in hell suffering eternal damnation. We don't see that until the final judgment. That's one of the keys. That's one of the things that we need to see that comes out of Revelation. Is that eternal suffering, that eternal hell? It's not fired up yet. It's not fired up until final judgment. Final judgment is when people are cast into hell. And final judgment doesn't come until the end of the book of Revelation. After all this happens. After the Son returns. Now this is from Revelation. This is the apocalyptic vision here. So it is Hades that followed with him. The realm of the dead. Out came a pale horse whose rider's name was Death, Hades, the realm of the dead, followed him. The two were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, with famine, with pestilence, with wild beasts of the earth. This is death. This is death. So, the rider on the horse and Hades, they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to just go out and kill. Kill in any way, shape, or form. Be it sword or famine, pestilence, by wild animals. And look, this is the important thing to see here. Notice that that the scroll, that God doesn't say to the rider on the horse, you can only kill the non-believer, or you can only kill the Gentile. No. Death has the right to just go and kill. So these visions, it doesn't matter whether you're a believer or not. Being a believer in Christ doesn't give you a sway from, if you're part of that quarter of the earth, being a believer in Christ doesn't give you salvation, safety from death. That's an important thing to know, because being a believer doesn't give us safety from death. We all die. Death happens. Sometimes it happens tragically. Sometimes good believers die young. Being a part of Christ doesn't give us the freedom, doesn't say that we're not going to die. Part of being faithful is being faithful unto death, regardless of how we die. So the fourth rider is death. So the four horsemen of the apocalypse: conquest, anarchy, famine, and death. And they symbolize the great tribulation of what is to be expected. Look, before the new heaven and the new earth, there needs to be great tribulation. This is kind of sifting the wheat and the chaff, and we're going to see this as we move forward. That those who are on the face of the earth when the four horsemen arrive, can the believer be faithful in the midst of conquest? Can the believer be faithful in the midst of anarchy? Can the believer be faithful in the midst of famine? Can the believer be faithful in the face of death? Those questions that were asked by John, brought forth by God in the book of Revelation, are still our questions today. And really, quite frankly, I think they're a lot harder to answer today than they ever were before. And one of the reasons why they're a lot harder to answer today than they ever were before is because our faith has become so easy. It has been. We're very blessed. We're very blessed in our context. We're very blessed that we're not persecuted for our faith. We're very blessed that we have everything that we need, or close to everything that we need. So that can make our faith soft. I've seen it. I've seen it in the midst of this pandemic. I've seen faith struggle in the midst of a pandemic because it hasn't been challenged. And for some, that's good. I'm glad that faith hasn't been challenged, because challenges are never acceptable or fun, but they're part of our reality. So the question that comes out of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, these tribulations, they're going to happen. A lot of them are happening right now. Can the believer be faithful in the midst of tribulation? It goes back to the question of Job. Remember the book of Job way back in the Old Testament. That was the question. That was the debate between God and the devil. The devil said to God, look, Job's faithful because everything's easy. Take everything away and he's going to lose his faith. So God relented and allowed the devil to take everything away from Job except his life. That was the deal. He can't kill him. Well, that's still our question today. How faithful can we remain in the midst of great tribulation? The book of Revelation shows us some avenues on how to remain faithful in the face of tribulation. Sorry, that word just wasn't coming out my mouth. But the four horsemen of the apocalypse go out, and the believer and the non-believer face what they bring. Can the believer be faithful in the midst of tribulation? And can that faith then help the non-believer have faith in the midst of tribulation? That's the big key. Remember, the job of the believer is to proclaim the gospel. All right, my friends, we're going to stop here for now. There's the four horsemen of the apocalypse for you. That's probably something you've been waiting for a while. I know a lot of people wait for that. That's a big thing. That's a big thing. So next week, we're going to pick up with session 12. So we're going to pick up with the fifth seal next week. So I'm just writing all that down so that I have all the information. I know that because this is recorded, it probably could be a lot more polished. The presentation could be a lot more polished. I probably could have waited until after I stopped recording in order to write down what our next session would be. But, part of what I want you to see is part of what I want you to experience is that if we were together, this is what Bible study would look like. Bible study, I don't want it to be a presentation in that it is polished and perfect, because studying the Bible is never polished and perfect. It's messy. You go back and forth. You stumble. I want you to see that, because you're going to do it too. Nobody has it all right. That's part of the deal. So I want you to see kind of that stumble, kind of that work, kind of that messiness. So when you're studying the Bible, you can have some strength and comfort in knowing that it can be messy. Hey, y'all have a great day. Have a great week. And we'll be back next week for session 12. Make sure that you go back if you haven't had a chance and check out the previous sessions. But it's been a joy so far. We'll see you next week for session 12. Have a great day.